So we've seen now that this main.js file is kickstarting the application, and it's taking the app component right here and it's passing it in as the root component to create app. Now we'll talk more about root components later on, but then it's mounting it to the DOM at this location. Now this right here, this is a Vue component and it's this file. So every Vue file represents a single Vue component and it has the .vue extension at the end. And by the way, to get the syntax highlighting in here so everything looks good, make sure you have that Vito package installed. I showed you that earlier. If we go to packages, I can scroll down here and see it installed. It's this one right here. So make sure you search for it up here and install it. Otherwise, this might look a bit off. Now, every Vue component can contain 3 different parts. First of all, an HTML template. We create it here now instead of in the HTML page like we did earlier. Second, we have a script where we export the component object right here. And finally, we have a style tag for any component styles, any styles you want to apply to this template. Now, the script and the styles right here, they are actually optional, but every component must at least have a template. So first of all, let's talk about that template. Before, when we used the CDN link to use Vue.js, we created the template directly inside the index.html file, inside app right here. But this time around, we don't do that. We create the template for a component inside its component file. And the reason for that is that we might have many different components with different templates, and they might not all show at the same time inside the index.html file. So we can't directly hardcode the templates in here because, like I said, they might not all show at the same time. And also, it would mean that if we have many components, this would get very messy very quick. So we split up our templates into different components for different parts of our web page, and each component has its own template at the top. Then when we render that component to the DOM, its template is injected into the DOM. Now, the root tag must always be a template tag right here. This is a Vue tag, not a regular HTML one, but inside that you can organize your template however you wish. Now, one new feature of Vue is that you can have multiple root elements inside the template right here. It used to be that you have to have one root element which surrounds everything, but now, as you can see, there's 2 root elements. We have an image and this component, which we'll talk more about later on. Now, this works fine, but it used to be that we had to do something like this, have a div tag, and then we could place all of this inside of this div, right? That was the old way of doing it, but like I said, you don't have to do that anymore, which is really nice. You can have as many root elements inside the template as you wish. So this template right here, this is what we see in the page over here. Now, it looks a lot more on the page than we see right here, but that's because this in itself is a component which is being inserted into this component. Now, we're going to talk more about multiple components later on, so what I'm going to do is just delete this template for now and create our own simple template, which is going to be an H1, and I'll just say my first Vue app, and then save it. And when I save, the development server is going to auto refresh this in the browser. So we can see that the template has been updated and now we see the new content on the page. Next up is the script tag that we see right here. And the first thing we do inside that is import this Hello World component from the components folder. This was the thing that we saw inside the template earlier. Now that's coming from the components folder. We're going to talk more about multiple components later on, so I'm going to leave that for now. And in fact, we'll delete it because we don't need the Hello World components inside this file anymore. Now, next we have this object right here, and we're exporting this object. Now, this object represents the root component, much like we represented the root component as an object when we used the Vue CDN in the previous chapter. It can contain things like data, methods, computed properties, etc. At the minute, this has got a name, and this is optional. You don't have to give your components a name, but in this case, we're calling it app. And then also, we have a components property, which is registering any extra components we're using inside this component. Now, again, we don't need this anymore because we're no longer using that Hello World component. So I'm just going to get rid of that. Now, Like I said, we can use data and methods inside this object, much like we did before. So if I want to make some data, I can just use the data function, which returns, remember, an object. And this object has a title property in our case, and that title is going to be my first Vue app, like so. And now, instead of hard coding this, we could just output the title instead. So let me do that, double curly braces, and then title. So the way we output data is exactly the same way in this template as we did previously. So let me save this and preview now of it in the browser, and we can see that is the new title right here. Awesome. So that works. So again, we'll work much more with this object as we go forward. And like I said before, it's actually optional to have this object, but most of the time when you make components, you'll find yourself needing data and methods for the component. So you probably, about 90% of the time, will use a component object. Okay, so finally we have this style tag, which is for the component styles. And you can see right here, we're styling the app div. Now that's not technically inside this component, but it doesn't matter because these styles are actually global. Even though they're inside this component file, they apply to any elements on the page. We can scope them just to this file, just to this component, but we'll see how to do that later on. So that's pretty much it. They're the three parts that make up our component. And I tell you what, actually, I'm just going to add one style down here for the H1 so you can see that this works. Let me do this, and I'll copy and paste these in so you don't have to watch me writing them out. We have a border bottom for the H1. We say display inline block and padding bottom. If I save that now, you can see now we get that border at the bottom and a bit of padding. All right. So when we render this component to the DOM, and remember, we're doing that inside the main.js file because we're saying the root component is app and we're mounting it right here. When that happens, all of this template is injected into the index file right here. And the styles right here, they are placed in the head. And we can see that if I inspect, we can go in the head and we can see some styles at some point right here. So these are the styles that we see inside the components. And you can see they're the new ones we just created, all right? Now, just very quickly, a couple more things. This assets folder, this is where we can place anything like images that we use inside components. And we saw before that we had an image up here and it was referencing this image right here. We will work with images later on throughout the course for different projects, but that's where they will go if we do use them. And secondly, again, we saw this components file. When we make multiple components, we will be placing them in there later on, but don't concern yourself too much with this for now. So there we go. That is a Vue component in a nutshell. So next, I want to quickly talk about another concept in Vue, and that is template refs. But just really quickly, before we do move on, I want to just point out one important thing to do with the course files from this point onwards in the course. If you're downloading any of the course files from this lesson onwards, there's one more step you have to take once you've opened up the project inside VS Code, and that is to install all of the project dependencies. So all of the project dependencies that live inside Node modules, they are not inside the GitHub repository files. So what you need to do is download those files, open up the project inside VS Code, and then you open up a terminal and you type npm install, and that will install all of the project dependencies listed inside the package.json file right here. And only then, once you've done that, will you be able to run the project by using this command right here, npm run serve. If you try that before doing the install, then it's not going to work. So again, make sure you run npm install once you download the course files before you try to run the project from this point onwards.